Thanks for being here. I'm really excited. Once again, I think I'm excited every week, but I've been looking forward to this Convocation presentation all semester. Before I introduce our speaker, though, I want to make a couple of announcements. You can predict what I'm going to remind you to do. There's 3 cultural events that you should go to. We did a little bit of a statistical analysis, and about 2/3 of the class haven't turned in a survey yet. Now, you have plenty of time, but this is a great week to get one of those cultural events done. And if you look out in the halls, there's several concerts coming up. The commercial music program is having a concert very soon. There's one about the 1968, the revolution in Eastern Europe. So there's an art exhibit, and there's a cultural spotlight night next week that will also count in place of a music event. And that's going to be 6 o'clock on the 7th. It's in the library auditorium. And one of the students in this class, Abdul Salam, is going to present. And the theme of the night's about Pakistan. And so it's a great time to come and just learn more about a fascinating country. If you have any questions, I'll be around afterwards. I'd remind you to put away your phones. Make sure that you're also a good neighbor. Please avoid whispering and talking during the presentation so people around you can hear. So our presenter today is George Handley, who's just a wonderful person. I served with George on a board a statewide board a few years ago, and I just really enjoyed our interactions, and I'm really glad he could come down to be part of this event. And he teaches environmental humanities at BYU. He's a literary scholar and a creative writer, one of those few people in my experience who can write really compelling nonfiction prose as well as do creative work. And he writes about the intersection between literature, religion, and the environment. His creative work includes a memoir entitled Home Waters and a recent novel, American Fork. And I have a copy of that if you're wanting to look at one right after. The bookstore may be carrying this, so you can find it there. You can find it online as well if you're wanting a copy. He also has a forthcoming collection of essays, If Truth Were a Child, that explores the relationship between the study of humanities and religious faith. He and his wife Amy have 4 children, and he currently serves on the City Council of Provo as well. So will you please join me in welcoming George Handley.
Wow, this is a very spacious stage. I feel very lonely up here, and you guys are all black all of a sudden. I'm really happy to be here, and I am grateful for David's invitation and honored to share a novel that I've written that he mentioned, American Fork. And let me just tell you a little bit of background about the story so that when I do my reading, you'll have some context. It's a story about 2 characters mainly, although there's a third who matters as well. But Zacharias Harker is a botanist, and he's somewhat of an aging recluse. And he's haunted by his mistakes and living without his wife and daughter for the past 20 years. And he hatches the idea to write a magnum opus, a book on the implications of climate change for humanity, focused on the wildflowers of the Wasatch Front. And just prior to the tragedy of 9/11, he hires a young artist named Alba, and you'll hear from both of them in the passages I'll read today, to paint flowers for the book. And over the course of their unlikely friendship, Harker convinces Alba to return to her native country of Chile to learn the story long hidden from her by her mother of her father's disappearance under Pinochet, the dictator. So she has some discoveries about her family history, and I won't get into those, but her experience listening to the stories of Chileans who've resisted a government ruled by fear inspire her return to Utah with renewed purpose. She commits her art to the protection of the environment, and as she's working on this book project with Mr. Harker, she's striving to learn more about his past, which he's not very willing to share before it is too late. So this story is really, it's an environmental story, it's a story about religion, and it's a story about American politics, and also a little bit about Latin American politics. So there's a little bit of everything in the story. The chapters alternate between the voice of Mr. Harker, who's been writing letters to his long since departed daughter for many years, and then an omniscient narrator who's telling a little bit of the story about his friendship with Alba. So this is a passage narrated by Mr. Harker in which he describes a conversation that he had with Alba. And Alba has just read the manuscript that he's been preparing, and she calls him on the phone. One more thing, Mr. Harker, I want to make sure you know this. This reading, I couldn't put it down, really. I think I understand things so much better now, even though I know you have been trying to tell me your ideas all along. But seeing it in its raw, handwritten form was quite moving. It wasn't too hard to follow, although I admit you move at quite a pace. I had to read it twice, slowly. It's a real testament to the beauty and value of this place. I don't know how to put it. Maybe this will offend you, but it feels like it says so much about you. I didn't expect that, and even though I know you don't consider yourself any longer a religious man, it felt like a good sermon. Yeah, I am offended, I said. Well, my point, Mr. Harker, is simply I just don't know that it could have been written with more religious passion, for what you often call this fragile world. You make the world feel holy. Did you mean to do that? Well, hell, I don't know. That depends on what you mean by holy. I'm not all that invested in the idea of natural theology. The idea that the world bears the signature of the Creator and that my job as a botanist is to do the translation. I made that clear in the manuscript. I mean, if his signature is on everything, it's all hieroglyphics anyway. No one's going to translate that stuff. Yeah, I saw that. But isn't that the mystery of it? I mean, I can't help thinking that you are still searching for God, she said. He isn't irrelevant. Just because you can't prove him doesn't mean he isn't there. She was good. I enjoyed this sort of thing more than I wanted to let on. Well, it doesn't mean he is either, I said. Well, sure, I'm not trying to prove his existence any more than you were trying to prove his inexistence, but what you wrote haunts me, and it feels like, I don't know, a presence, I guess. I don't know how else to put it. I just don't see how what you wrote makes sense in a world where God can't exist. God's existence makes me want to paint until the sun comes up or until I starve. And painting to me feels like prayer, a good all-night prayer. It seems art is worth doing precisely because of the possibility that there is a God. Well, tell that to the existentialists, I said. I have wondered about that, she said. Maybe they are the exceptions. Maybe even they need the possibility of his existence to make their denial meaningful. Or maybe it's just because God won't be pinned down because he likes to keep things interesting. Ain't that the truth, I said. It's an interesting world, she said. There's no denying it. Well, if my writing makes you want to paint, I concede. The world is holy, God is real, go for it. Just paint, damn it, paint. She laughed. I knew I could force a confession from you. Don't get confused. Concession is not confession. Whatever. I just think I came away thinking a lot, too, about our fragile presence here, on this earth. There is such beauty in that idea. I kept thinking about the irony. Something dies and we mourn its loss, and suddenly we see it more profoundly than ever before, even though it is gone. And it's almost as if you have to experience death or no death to really see life. And this was before her trip to Chile, so she didn't yet appreciate the irony of what she said next. I didn't experience my father's death directly, she says, but he looms larger because I have lived my life in his shadow. And I feel like I'm searching all the time. Makes me see things along the way I would have otherwise missed, I suppose. Reading your prose made me feel that this world, the mountains, the flowers, the water, all of it is some kind of compensation somehow. So I just wanted to make sure I said thanks. I haven't really ever expected much from people, and I certainly would never expect that from most. Your mom and I talked a lot, of course. It was the way she entertained my doubts and my questions with such directness, with such sincerity. I never really felt like she was trying to steer me or shape me. She never cut corners in her own thinking, and if I sounded like a fool, why, she would let me know right off. You couldn't get away with hyperbole with her. She was utterly reasonable, but faithful too, in the religious sense. She seemed open to God, open enough to allow questions, to admit what she didn't know or understand, but all that space for questions never seemed to shake her trust in God. That was the kind of faith I wanted. Seems like the only kind, really. Otherwise, it's just some kind of stubborn insistence and presumption of knowing far more than we do. Her faith was ultimately what drew me to the church and made me feel like belief was possible. Problem is, there are far too such people in the world. I can't waste my time with those whose certainties about the world are unshakable. For every good brother Jorgensen, there is an equal and opposite force in the church, the member who feels it is his duty to announce repeatedly how others should be measuring up, as if the purpose of life were some exam to test how right we are in our thinking about issues, how right we are in our daily behavior, as if the sum total of our human existence were found in what we think and do. Seems like God said something about how we look at the external man, but he looks upon men's hearts. Seems like Jesus was all about the heart, not the mind, not the words, not even the actions, but our hearts. He wants our hearts laid on the altar. It's a gory image, but it captures the essence of the Christian religion. But for some reason, the religion inspires armies of nosy know-it-alls, folks who see nuance and irony and paradox precisely nowhere and precisely never. And not 1 ounce of recognition that it is because of our nature as beings who often intend well but fail that makes Christ necessary. In their minds, what's wrong with the world is simply that men fail. No kidding. That's like saying what's wrong with the world is that something is wrong with the world, and what would make it right is that if everything were, right. For them, it simply boils down to the fact that people aren't trying hard enough. And instead of shining the light of divine compassion and love on the world, they expend their energies coming up with yet another socializing scheme to motivate, cajole, or otherwise herd people into moral conformity. I mean, the whole lot of them seem downright proud to be incapable of changing their minds about anything. And yet right there in their own scriptures, God himself makes it clear. Your thoughts are not mine, so just knock it off. Mom's trust might have been unshakable, but it never seemed to translate into unshakable certainty about what she thought she understood about the world or God's working in it. I mean, any honest look at the world has to at least give us pause and teach us wisdom of silence once in a while. Besides, if God is so almighty, why the hell would why would he need puny brains like ours to defend him? I remember one time I was particularly heated about a comment Sister Mansfield made at church. She wanted everyone to know that she and her family had recently decided to up the ante and stop watching PG-13 movies. Avoiding R-rated movies just wasn't enough, and as a result, their son got into college. Her daughter's wedding plans had gone much more smoothly, and I don't know what else. Maybe it didn't rain on the wedding day or something about the cost of the sprinkler system. Seems like God has an excessive interest in the Mansfields, I said as we were driving home. Seems like he really feels it is important to make their life as cozy as can be. Seems like he owes the poor Connect family an apology, I said, considering as how Brother Connect never failed anyone as far as we know. But well, I guess he watched too many PG-13 movies and had to come down with cancer, suffer untellable pain, and then die, leaving 4 kids without a father. Seems like God feels pretty strongly about movie ratings, I said, even enough to make a point of it. Mom just listened to my rant. You were in the back, and you were young enough that it was mostly lost on you. I will say that when you got older, Mom would usually urge me on to other topics with her savvy so that my cynicism wouldn't infect you. But this time, Mom just absorbed the waves of venom that came out of me. Stuff like that made me crazy, made me not want to be a party to such lousy theology. I mean, sometimes it seems as if God took quite a gamble, believing he could trust us enough with some basic revelations to guide our lives. What a mess we have made of God. We are such children. Maybe because of our intense desire to do right by God, we invented a veritable playbook of how to live, how to dress, what to read, and all the bad things we need to weed out of our lives so that we could have guaranteed protection from life's whims. Problem is, it turns out that learning the playbook takes so much time and energy, we seem to have little energy left for worrying ourselves about the fate of the world's poor or the planet. No, by golly, we have to get poor Jonathan from looking at too many boobs, and we need to get Jenny to stop hiking her skirts above the knee, because you see, these are the things that really matter, the things upon which our fate depends. Well, I gave your mom an earful, and she just listened, and occasionally she smiled at my witticism while she drove. She thought I was funny when I ranted, which in a way comforted me, made me feel like maybe I could laugh too, but she never joined me in a good rant. How I wish she would have. I was often frustrated that she wouldn't, but even though I knew deep down she knew there was at least a kernel of truth to my frustrations. Ultimately, it was just therapy. She would sincerely listen, and even without her saying anything, I would feel better. Rarely, but often enough to keep me honest, she would push back like she did that day. By the time we got to the house, I was pretty well spent. She turned off the car, pulled the keys out, and stopped and looked at me with kindness, not with judgment. Did you know that Sister Mansfield lost her father to suicide? Of course I didn't, so I just sat there. Practically had to raise her siblings, your mom continued. She means well enough. I know why these things bother you, I get it. She just needs to hold tight to a few certainties to get her through. That woman lives life with white knuckles, terrified of what she might lose. But I will say this, she has more discipline and determination than just about anyone I know. And then the zinger. She didn't mean it to hurt, but definitely wanted to teach me a little humility. She has always been good to our little family, and she says nothing but nice things about you. Still hurts to remember it. I did vow to try harder after that, I assure you, and I think I did. That was back in my penitent days, back when, with a little help from your mom from time to time, I could find my way back into the pews on Sunday without suffering too much. But you know, after you left, I couldn't feel any comfort from all the kindness and charity from the ward, least of all when people said things about how there was a divine purpose to it all and that it was all for the best. And without your mom to talk me back from the edge of cynicism, I couldn't help myself. I started telling people just flat out how utterly ridiculous I thought their faith was, how nonsensical. I guess I wanted to know how far I had to go before that veneer of niceness would wear off on everyone. I offended everyone in sight, even poor Sister Mansfield. I might as well confess it, and you can tell Mom, and you can both shake your heads at me, but one night, she dropped by with a meal, and I could sense she was nervous. Truth be told, I was sitting in the living room at that moment full of piss and vinegar. I mean, I was mad at God. And there she came to my door holding a warm pot of stew, a smile, and her attempt at comforting words. I noticed the tight grip of her hands on the pot handles, and maybe I noticed how white her knuckles were, I don't know. She said something about your mother, about how kind she had always been to her, and that she was sure the Lord was making good use of her skills, teaching all those needy souls up there. Well, maybe she can teach that stupid-ass father of yours a thing or two about courage. It just came out in some weird way. I think I felt like it was a compassionate thing to say, but it came out distorted, like in a funny mirror. It's been that way for a long time. I mean, to be honest, I might even mean well, but it always seems I am like the bowl in the proverbial china shop, unable to move without destroying things. She went ashen, stared at me in disbelief, and dropped the pot on the step and ran back to her car. She never had the courage to come back for the pot, and I never had the courage to return it, so there it sits in the pantry storing my potatoes. I guess if I think I am confessing, it's because I feel that I was wrong, but it honestly felt good at the time. It was a relief to feel fully and completely separated. Solitude gave me solace somehow. I felt free for the first time in my life, free to haunt the mountains, to be haunted by you and your mother with no interference. So you can see, can't you, the dilemma that Alba and her questions present to me. You are silent, but she, on the other hand, asks questions and talks back, pushes me, urges me towards reasonableness and kindness and decency and trust. You probably like that. I'm going to skip ahead here. We like to think that there will be things that only in death we can truly understand. We also like to believe that belief should remain independent of life circumstances somehow, that I should be able to believe no matter what happens to me. That was the point of the story of Job, I guess, but who is like him? God takes everything away and then takes him high into the mountains and asks him what he knows about the breadth and the depth of the earth, what he knows about the treasures of the snow, the wilderness where there is no man, what he knows about the rain, about when the wild goats have sex and have calves. What does he know of the Leviathan, the behemoth? I guess if Job had lived here, he might have asked about the peregrine falcons, about the limber pine, about the sculpins and the daces in his streams, and, well, the primroses, the wild carrot, and surely the black bear and the mountain lion and the bighorn sheep, the mountain goats, the elk, the deer, all of them. And you know, I have seen all of them. I mean, he would go on, and I would have been able to at least nod in recognition of most of it. Fact is, there are a lot of people paying attention to these things these days. So that's not the problem. The problem is that not too many others are paying attention to them. God, you see, he searches after every green thing. That's what he tells Job. Those are his words. Botany is his profession, his work. He is the father of the rain. It's all his, you see. Nothing escapes his notice. Didn't Jesus say he notes the sparrows fall? Hell, he could ignore my hair if he wants, but pay attention to the sparrows. Yes, for God's sake, and here I am not taking his name in vain. Pay attention to the sparrows. I don't claim to have godlike knowledge or anything, but you know, if there's one thing I try to do, it is to search after every green thing. I want nothing more than to understand how all these plants, insects, animals, ecosystems, how they replicate, copulate, why, when, how they feed themselves, how they defecate, where their bones rest, what happens to their flesh, what in essence is the flesh of the earth, and why, for God's sake, do I get to take it all in? So I read Job over and over, and one thing I can't get my mind around is why Job doesn't curse God after all, because even after everything is restored, is it really a new family? What about the old one? Is he supposed to forget they never existed? They ever existed? Isn't loving the new going to be perpetually haunted by that loss? What would be so wrong with a curse or two anyway? What would be so wrong about a good old-fashioned rant? Is God so weak he can't handle a little criticism, a little whining from his children? Okay, fine. Job was a perfect man. But the rest of us, life leaves us wanting to spit venom until someone starts listening. Why can't we? Why shouldn't we? I have, and no one has struck me dead or dumb yet. But that's just it. I guess my best guess is that no one is listening. Not God, not you, and for all I know, no one will ever read my book. We are all stone deaf. Well, Alba isn't deaf, at least. I grant her that. I gave her an earful not too long ago about Job, and she listened, and she was moved. She could tell I spoke from a place of great pain, and she felt compassion. She didn't offer answers, but of course, I couldn't tell her everything. I barely told her anything at all. Is that wrong of me? She went home that night and called me from her home. It was kind of late, but no one calls here, least of all at that hour, so of course I answered. Mr. Harker? Yes, Alba, what's going on? Sorry to bother you. I just want to ask you something about Job. Would that be all right? Of course. Shoot. Well, I was reading Job, reading it real careful, and well, I don't want to be one of those friends who offers you words of wisdom in your pain and only adds salt to your wounds. The truth is, I don't know what you've been through. I want to know. I want you to know that. I didn't really know what to say to that, but I felt frozen, so I just left her voice hanging there in the ether. So she continued. Well, so I was reading what the Lord says to Job in those passages you were telling me about. I've never noticed them before. I've never even heard about them. Why is that? Why would such an important speech about the creation, so central to the whole story, go totally unremarked in our Sunday school lessons? I don't know that God ever speaks for so long uninterrupted anywhere in all of Scripture, and we don't even talk about it. Well, don't get me started, I said, but you might consider the fact that those questions God poses make no sense to someone who doesn't know the wilderness. Presumably, Job knew enough to know what he was up against in life, as would any other citizen of his century anywhere on the planet. I mean, people knew what it took to live, to survive, and they knew that nature could eat them, that it would, given the chance. Fear of God back then, you see, was the same as fear of nature. Still was by the time the Mormons crossed the plains. But we have beat nature back now, or at least we think we have, and that's the arrogance of our time, We are offended by the very thought that we're making a mess of the systems of life. And what, after only a few generations of having made our modern advances over nature? We are an incredibly stupid species, I tell you. It's not like we don't have libraries full of the world's wisdom. It's not like we don't have access to the information that can tell us what we are doing to the planet, but we deny the whole of it. So we just don't relate to what the Lord is saying, she asked. I guess, something like that. That's my guess anyway. Nature's been cut off from Christianity as it has from most religions. It's apathy that Christianity preaches nowadays, apathy toward the suffering of God's creation. Well, can't we recover some of that, she asked? I mean, can't we make it right? Those verses, they shook me, and it's not like those verses have gone anywhere. They're still there. Well, if anyone can pull that off, it would be people like you, Alba. I don't believe in God and I don't believe in religion, but I believe in you. You should believe in God. Sorry if that offends you. You understand him better than most. You just haven't gotten over your anger for some reason. Well, if there's anyone capable of rekindling my belief, it's you, Alba, but don't work too hard at it. I can sniff out those Mormon stratagems better than anyone. I meant it. I still do. I think that is what causes me so much fear right now, because it sounds childish to say this, but if I lose her and John, her husband, I have nothing left. What do you make of this verse in chapter 40, she asked. God is in the middle of his speech. Job says he is vile, that he will, basically shut up from now on, that he knows nothing, and that he accepts God's will. And the Lord tells him, here, let me read it to you. Gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee and declare thou unto me. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? What do you make of that? I don't really know, Alba. I will need to look at that. Why? What do you think of it? Well, it seems that maybe the Lord is saying something about belief, that if you're going to accept the idea of God, being the creator of everything, of having all that power, then you can't spend your time trying to justify yourself or to justify experience. And especially if you love nature and can appreciate something of its beauty, you shouldn't expect your own life to make any more sense than, the sight of an eagle snatching a trout in its talons. Remember that day we saw the eagle on the Provo do that? I will never forget it. Because, making too much sense of things ends up missing the mark, and all you end up with is a narrative that blinds you to, the reality and glory of God. You will spend your life making sense of God, but will instead end up justifying yourself and know nothing about him. Or for that matter, nothing about yourself. Well, you can see I have a treasure in my life, someone who speaks to me so gently of things that I sometimes wonder if you nudged her my way. I know that sounds uncharacteristic of me, but in my softer moments, I almost want to believe it. Through the mouths of babes. I couldn't say that to her because it sounds like an offense. She is no child, but still. Is this one of your stratagems right now? Did you call me just to get me to read those verses? She laughed. Of course it is, Mr. Harker. What would you expect? I will never give up on you. Thanks, Alba. You have a good night, I said. I mean it. Never. Good night, Mr. Harker, and God bless you. I'll just read one last passage in which Mr. Harker recounts a little bit of his early life. I was born in what is now Torrey in 1930. It was a brief existence there, but it was nice enough. I don't remember a whole lot about it from my childhood, but as a park ranger, I would get to know every corner of the area. My mother had grown up in neighboring Loa, a tiny blink of a town on the way to nowhere. She didn't meet Dad until after she had been doing secretarial work in Salt Lake for many years and traveled around the world with a close girlfriend. Somewhere in there, she must have developed her opium habit, but they briefly settled in Torrey because my father had an offer to help run a ranch there. They got pregnant twice and then left the town and their one buried child behind 5 years later with their only remaining progeny, me. Dad was trying to get away from mining, which is all he had ever known in Vernal. I can remember Mother's laughter, and I can remember her bouncing me on her knee, taking me on walks, talking to me about everything under the sun. Dad went to school at Carbon College when it opened in 1937 to study soil science. And that's when I found Mom dead on the sofa one day after school. Don't ask me how she got her drugs. No doubt she had enablers. I never asked my father if he was one of them. I didn't have time to sort things out before my dad was gone too, just a few years later, and just months after he had graduated and taken a job in Price. I know I told you that story already, but I guess I'm trying to sort out here what my legacy is and what I can say that I have learned. I moved around a lot after that, and I never really felt at home inside the walls of a house. I could feel utterly alone outside and utterly at home at the same time. And while I hungered for human contact whenever I got it, it only reminded me of what had been taken from me, so I wasn't much for holding on. So I guess being a hermit has become my way of being in the world, because I was only too aware of the high costs of caring for and attaching yourself to others. But there was no getting around it either, as one discovers soon enough, especially in Mormon life. Always someone reaching out, and every so often someone you decide you care to have around. Fact is, few people are better than the Mormons. Who could I name? Sister Jensen in Price. She was my first caretaker after my dad died. No blood relation, but a middle-aged single woman with beehive hair, floral dresses, and permanently in an apron, it seemed. She did laundry for the neighbors, so I remember her ironing all the time. She was kind. If I was good, which I usually was, she made caramels for me. They were goopy and delicious, and she always had to wipe my face and hands after I was done. We prayed together. She always prayed for my parents by name and asked the good Lord to be merciful to me, to let me know that I was loved. It wasn't long before my cousins had arranged for me to come to Manti for the summer. They were good people, from my mother's aunt, Ethel. Her husband was a nut. I remember that much, always yelling, "God is good," at the top of his lungs when he would come home from work, whatever it was he did all day. He gave his kids and me big bear hugs. Those hugs frightened me. I would go as limp as I could so that he wouldn't crack my ribs. And he liked to give charismatic prayers at dinner and while we all held hands. Ethel was stressed out all the time, I remember that, which is not surprising given the passel of children who ran in and out of the house at all hours. I don't even remember how many kids there were, but I do know there was never enough food and never enough money. They didn't need another kid in that house, so it wasn't long before they found a place for me in Salt Lake with a foster family named Harrington and Draper. Steady income, good school, a room to myself, and foothills to explore. I was raised more by the church at that point than I was by the Harringtons. They were kind enough, but they needed the money, and they had the room in their house since 2 of their children had already left home. Brother Harrington was an electrician, so he had steady work, even if low-paying, and Sister Harrington quilted and sold blankets. Sometimes I helped, and their last daughter, Maggie, an obese girl with low self-esteem, was a few years older than I. It was Brother Darling whom I remember the most from those years. We kept in touch for some time after that. He did make it to the wedding. He was my scout leader and taught me everything he knew about the outdoors, and probably first gave me the idea of working for the Forest Service. I never knew if he had children. He never talked about them. I have often wondered if he had broken relationships he didn't like to talk about. He lived alone. But I was pretty sure he had been married. So I guess you could say I was raised by the church in essence, and there were some good surrogates, but I was so transient there was scarcely a chance for anything to last. By the time I married, my guest list consisted of a few friends from the Park Service and Brother Darling. My cousins from Manti had not kept in touch much, and I didn't really know them anyway, and the Harringtons moved to California after I graduated from high school. I generally had the impression that the rest of the world had rooms and things and pets and street corners that were theirs. To me, the whole world was a foreign place, always worth exploring, but never quite deserving of my permanent residence. I suppose that by now I could consider myself a native of American Fork. I mean, I have been here for the better part of 30 years. This was the first and only home I ever owned, and we had no intention of going anywhere, but clearly circumstances have left me stranded whether I wanted it or not. And I have liked this place just fine, more than fine. Thankfully, it wasn't stolen from me. My paths to the trails are well worn. I know every tree, every plant on the property. I know which trees lose their leaves first, always the maples, and which last, always the mulberry, unless you count the sycamores, which start earlier, but basically never finish, dropping their leaves until the spring buds finally force out the remaining diehards. I know the moods of the stream that runs past the house, its sources in the mountains. I have worn down every object in the house. Just look at my hairbrush, and you will know what I mean. I think I've owned it since 1945. My books, they're mine through and through. No one else has been arguing in the margins with the authors. My appliances, my clothes, my furniture. I haven't had much interest in upgrades. I haven't traveled in ages, except for journeys into the mountains and up the canyons, and occasionally an occasional trip down to Provo for meetings related to the book. But really, I haven't been anywhere for a long time. But I dare say I have the largest sense of community of anyone, given my natural environment, which is why it is strange to find myself on this fine summer afternoon feeling anxious, like I need to get out of here, wanting to see the old grounds, maybe a drive. Of course, knowing me, if I take the drive, I will drive to the mountains, and then when I see the fire roads leading up to the trailheads, well, it will be all over at that point. I do want to see Price, but the idea of fishing and wandering and losing myself on the south side of Boulder Mountain where I first met your mother appeals to me the most. This tired old body has something left in it yet, I'll bet. I wouldn't mind seeing that very spot where she squatted down and blew on the fire as she held her hair back with her left hand. I would just lay my back down against the same tree, sit down with my back leaning against the same rock, and wait and look and listen, and maybe she would come to me. She would take my hand and ask me where I've been and tell me that she had forgiven me a long, long time ago and that it was time for me to get on with the business of living and loving. And she would tell me that she had read my book, that she was proud of it, that you were well, that you had enjoyed my letters, that you had so much to tell me, and that our reunion would be sweet, that it was only a matter of time, that I shouldn't worry myself about things anymore, that I should look back over the course of my whole life without remorse or hurt, and that maybe if I looked carefully enough, I could see the graceful arc of mercy over the whole of it running in and through and around everyone I knew, in all the places I had seen, and present at every moment of surprise I had experienced in the mountains. Every time a cottontail darts across my path or the mule deer stop and stare as they do before lifting their haunches up the side of the mountain to wherever they're going, or whenever the light catches the grasses in the foothills and lights them on fire, all of it, every moment of beauty was a moment of mercy, was mercy itself. She would know, and she would understand, and she would show me what path awaits me. She would even forgive me for being such a fool for holding on to her as I have. It wouldn't seem strange to her at all because she alone would understand how she had given shape and meaning to things for me and why, without her, I had had to hold myself still and steady right here in this little house, in this corner of the valley among these hills so as not to fall off the edge of the world and lose myself forever. Because my memories were a mercy too, anchors that held me more than I held them. And as memories, they were my story, my very being. She would tell me that those present and those absent are one, that we are not separated, but that we inhabit each other's dreams and speak so softly into each other's ears that we can no longer tell the difference between our words and thoughts and those of our loved ones who are gone, because language is our prayer, our reunion, our resurrection. It is our incarnation because, you see, we don't believe in our own flesh unless we can translate it into the ether. This word is my flesh and my blood, and Marianne and Sophie and Mom and Dad and all the rest are no more absent than I am from this page. I am always already gone here where my elbow rests on this table, and my hands press against this paper and make visible the tables of my heart gone. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to see if anyone's asking them, however, so I don't know if somebody can help me. There we go. Yes, David.
Could you say more about how September 11th plays out in the book?
Yeah. So the novel takes place just before 9/11 happens, and then it concludes right after the 2002 Winter Olympics, and that happened in Salt Lake. Yeah, I'll get to you in just a second. And it's sort of a period of time in American culture, as I lived through it here, that felt to me like American culture was changing in some significant ways. I sort of compare that a little bit to the experience that Alba has. About a third of the novel takes place in Chile, and she goes back and searches for her father's story. And the coup that led to the dictatorship of Pinochet also happened on September 11th, but 1973. So there's a little bit of comparison going on between the two countries in her mind in terms of how they're both dealing with fears about chaos, about disorder, about political enemies, and how they're handling that. And she returns to Utah just as the Olympics are about to happen. So I kind of situated it in that moment historically because I felt like it was a moment that for me changed America, and it's never been the same since in a lot of ways. So it's very much a novel actually about today, but it's put back, you know, 20 years or whatever, 18 years. So to give some context for that. You had a hand up over here. Well, there's an experience you have when you create characters that take a long. This took a long time to write. I thought about these two characters for many years before I actually started writing, and it was very hard for me to figure out the plot. But while I was sort of stewing over plot line, I was getting to know them better and better in my heart, and so it sounds really strange to say, but it's hard for me to imagine that they're not real. They feel like old friends to me. So, yeah. Yes.
I have a question and a follow-up question.
Okay.
Are you yourself religious?
Yes.
I'm not religious, and I found that a lot of things the non-religious person said are a lot more accurate than I've heard in other interpretations. So how do you come up with if you're religious, how do you come up with the kind of more accurate ideas and thoughts of the non-religious?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Actually, that means I did something right. When I was in high school, I grew up in a high school that did a lot of play productions, oddly enough. It was the hometown of Paul Newman, who was a famous actor back in the day. And I did a lot of acting in high school. And we were taught a method that's actually from a Russian dramatist, Stanislavski, and we were taught how to sort of identify with the life story of a character. So even if you had a small role, you were expected to fill in every little detail of that person's life in your mind so that when you came out and delivered your 2 lines on stage, there was some real depth to the character. And I think at some point I realized I needed to start using that kind of empathy in the creation of the characters. I mean, you know, I think both characters, Alba's very religious and Harker is not. And in some ways, I suppose they're both kind of alter egos of myself. I mean, I was also thinking as a woman for a good part of the novel and really having to put myself aside. And when you do that, you do try to tap into whatever you have inside you that can at least relate, even if you no longer feel the same. But to be honest, and you heard enough about his story was entirely plausible to me, and I could see myself being exactly in the same shoes as he was in had I gone through many of the experiences he had been through. So I didn't stage him as like a caricature of a certain philosophical position. It was a real person to me who was really wrestling. And whenever I could, I invested my own real thoughts and feelings. But I think, you know, I have non-religious family members and friends, and grew up in Connecticut, did all my schooling in California. So as a Latter-day Saint, I was around people who believed in other religions or believed in no religions, and I was always a part of a very diverse community. So it wasn't a real hard stretch for me to imagine how, you know, and I've read a fair amount of philosophy and other things as a humanities professor, so I think that helped too, just being exposed to different ways of thinking and feeling. So, you know, and just on that point, I mean, one of the great things a novel does is it really creates genuine dialogue and interaction between different forces and different characters, and it hopefully, if it's done right, it helps your imagination expand, right? So that even if you're reading about the story of someone who's very different from you, they can hopefully become a part of you, and that I think is a really valuable ethical and moral principle in our encounter with fiction.
Time for about one more question.
Or not, that's fine. All right, thank you so much for coming, I appreciate it.
May you have auspiciousness and causes of success. May you have the confidence to always do your best. May it take no effort in your being generous, sharing what you can, nothing more, nothing less. May you know the meaning of the word happiness.